Good evening, dear listener. I'm glad you've joined me here tonight. Before we begin, I'd like you to find your most comfortable place. Maybe dim the lamp beside your chair, or let the night breeze slip through a half-open window. You might even hear the hum of a quiet fan, or the creak of a house settling around you. Let those gentle sounds keep you company. Tonight's story wanders back more than a century to a world that many of our grandparents or their parents once knew well, the long trenches of the First World War. Life there was unlike anything we imagine today. Days filled not with grand battles alone, but with waiting, with mud, with small mercies that meant everything. If you find comfort in these journeys through time, I would be grateful if you tap that little button to like or even subscribe. It lets me keep bringing you more evenings like this, and perhaps you'll leave a note sharing where you're listening from and the time of night it is for you. I always find it heartwarming to know this circle of quiet stretches across the world. Now, settle in, breathe slowly, let the day's noise fall away like dust in lamplight. We'll begin not with the roar of guns, but with something far softer, a quiet hope whispered in the dark. A secret hope rests quietly in the heart. In the earliest hours, when the trench lay hushed, and the only sounds were the drip of water from timbers and the shuffle of boots in distant corners, a man would sometimes draw a folded scrap of paper from his breast pocket. No one else would see it. No one else needed to. The act itself was enough, pressing the fragile paper between rough fingers, tracing the familiar handwriting with the pad of a thumb. This was his hope, not the loud, trumpet-blaring kind spoken in speeches or printed in newspapers. No, this hope was quieter, smaller, but more enduring. Perhaps it was a promise he made to himself that he would return to the bakery on the corner of his childhood street, and the smell of fresh bread would greet him again. Or perhaps it was a line from a mother's letter. "We are well, though we miss you," written weeks ago, yet read again and again, until the words blurred into memory. In the trenches, hope was not shouted. It was carried silently. It lived in talismans tucked deep into coats, a silver coin, a pressed flower, a lock of hair tied in ribbon. Each man had something different, yet the ritual was much the same. When the shells grew too near, when the mud pulled at boots until knees ached, when lice itched at seams of woolen tunics, a man would reach for that hidden fragment of another world. Even Thomas, the grizzled corporal whose voice rasped like gravel, carried his own kind of secret charm. One night, during a rare lull, he lifted a dented tobacco tin and tapped it gently. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a tiny pair of knitted baby socks. "Boy's near 2 now," he muttered, almost embarrassed to reveal it. He didn't need to explain further. In that one gesture, the silent weight of longing filled the air. What startled men most was not always the thunder of artillery, but the way a quiet longing could cut through even louder fears. A single whiff of imagined perfume, a remembered laugh, the crackle of fire back home in memory. These struck deeper than the scream of shells. The body could endure mud, cold, and even gas masks that clung to the face like a coffin lid. But the heart needed hope to survive. There was something almost shocking in how fragile those hopes were, and yet how stubbornly they endured. In a place where rats fattened on the fallen and water sometimes rose so high that boots drowned, the idea of a warm kitchen or a hand clasped across a table became stronger than barbed wire. Now and then, men would joke about it. Gallows humor, they called it. When I'm home, "I'll kiss the ground before I kiss my missus," one would laugh, drawing a few tired smiles. Yet behind the humor lay truth. These whispered hopes were not grand speeches. They were survival. And when the whistles blew and men clambered up over the top, some carried their private charm in their fists, clenched tight as though it might hold back bullets. Most knew it would not. But the act itself gave courage, and courage gave them one more step forward. A century later, when you and I sit by the safety of our homes, it is easy to forget that the war was carried not just in strategy and maps, but in folded letters, in socks, in trinkets small enough to fit in a palm. The quietest hopes often outlived the loudest cannons. And so, in this first part of our journey, we begin not with gunfire, but with that fragile ember each man carried. Sometimes trembling, sometimes steady, but always glowing in the shadows. Gentle routines paint the shape of ordinary days. At first light, when the sky is neither night nor morning, but some soft, undecided blue, the trench remembers its manners. A whisper goes down the line, not a command so much as a habit that has learned to speak. Stand to. Men rise from dugouts like figures waking in a quiet house, the way a grandfather might slip on his shoes before the rest of the family stirs. There is no rush. There is no show. Just the steady choreography of people who have done the same small things so often that the movements have become a kind of prayer. You take your place on the fire step with Thomas beside you, his breath making pale clouds, his cap tilted to that same angle he swears keeps luck from slipping off. The world ahead is a gray pasture of wire and hedged earth, and for a few held minutes nothing happens. Exactly the miracle everyone wished for. Even the birds seem to agree. One ventures a note from somewhere behind the lines. Another answers. It is ordinary music, which is to say, precious. When the all-clear nod comes, the trench exhales and begins the day. A kettle is set over a shielded flame, a blackened tin that has boiled more comfort than any cauldron in storybooks. Water thick with a chlorine tang turns to tea the color of varnished wood. Sugar is spooned with ceremony. The first sip warms all the way down, and the second reminds every man of kitchens that still exist somewhere, of mothers and wives and a crooked mug left near a familiar sink. One soldier swears that if he ever opens a shop, he will sell nothing but hot tea and socks. He will do well. Everyone agrees. Breakfast arrives by steps and murmurs. There is bread, sturdy, honest, a little tired from the journey, and there is beef from a tin that keeps its promises better than it keeps its shape. Someone produces jam with a flourish, and the entire company leans closer, as if a magician has pulled summer from his sleeve. A biscuit proves its strength by refusing a knife. Thomas suggests using it to prop a wobbly table that no longer exists. Laughter travels in low waves, the kind of humor that rubs the edge off things without pretending to sharpen them. After the kettles, there is cleaning. Always cleaning. A rifle laid out on a rag looks almost elegant, the way careful tools do in a carpenter's shop. You run an oiled patch through the barrel, working by feel as much as sight, the metal answering with a gentle slip and sigh. Thomas hums under his breath and checks the bolt face as if it were a pocket watch he means to pass to a grandson one day. A private new to the line watches closely, then imitates the motions with more care than certainty. Good, Thomas says, not looking up. Make friends with it. You two will be together a while. It is both instruction and blessing. There is shaving too, not for vanity, but for the seal of a mask should it be needed. Tin mirrors bloom with fog, and faces appear from the blur like photographs in a tray of developer. Soap smells faintly of home. The sound of the razor is small and steady, like a pencil drawing a quiet line. You think of the old barber shop you knew as a boy, how the men there talked about weather and prices and baseball, and never about fear. These are the same conversations, only edited for the times. Mail comes most days in its own weather, sometimes a drizzle, sometimes a shower, sometimes nothing at all. This morning, the corporal with the ledger rounds the traverse with a bundle under his arm. He calls names in a voice that knows how to soften. Letters pass from hand to hand. There are small packages too, knitted scarves, chocolate, a newspaper with stale headlines that feel fresh anyway. You receive a thin envelope, your name misspelled just as it always is by an aunt who refused to let schoolmasters teach her otherwise. It is a comfort to be misnamed in a familiar way. Men step aside to read in private, though privacy here is a polite fiction. Heads bow. The page becomes a small window you lean toward. There is news about a neighbor's new baby, a cousin's engagement, the way the apple tree finally bore too many apples and had to be propped with a broom. Ordinary information is the gold standard. It steadies the pulse. When someone laughs softly or draws a sleeve across a wet eye, no one intrudes. Letters are stitched conversation, two hands holding one piece of paper from opposite sides of the world. Work follows, as work always does. A party sets to the drainage, coaxing reluctant water into obedient channels. Duckboards are lifted and relaid. The trench is a living thing, always needing a rub here, a bandage there. You pack a sandbag with earth scooped from the parapet and knot it quick, your fingers learning that economy of motion a seamstress would admire. Another man ties his with the same neat twist he once used in a sailor's line, and for a moment he's aboard a ship again, smelling salt instead of clay. A small smile crosses his face and goes, not hurried away but gently stored. At mid-morning, the wind shifts and brings with it the smell of baking from a village 5 miles back. Whether the scent is real or simply remembered hardly matters. The entire line lifts its head like a field of flowers turning to sun. Thomas says that his mother's bread had a crust that sang when it cooled, and there is a beat of silence to picture that old, homely hymn. Someone else recalls grease pencils and grocer's paper, the trace of flour left on a counter, a woman dusting her hands. You would think these men were discussing masterpieces. They are. A runner slips by with a message tube against his chest. He moves with that low, practiced gait, a leaf on its way to water. He nods to Thomas and you, not stopping. The nod travels further down the line like a signal passed along at a country fair. Runners know the footpaths of this world, the way postmen once knew the names on every door. Their trade is trust. There are small repairs all afternoon. A rack reforged from a crate, a shelf set straighter with a wedge, a roof patched where last night's drizzle found a language of its own. An old door rescued from a broken farmhouse becomes the front of a dugout and provides, by some gentle alchemy, an address. See? Thomas says, patting the wood where a doorknob once shone. Home. He plants a nail and raps it true. The sound is the most domestic thing you have heard in weeks. In quieter minutes, men make small things that travel far. A spoon filed smooth to fit a pocket. A little frame for a photograph cut from a biscuit tin and polished with sleeve and care. Someone who used to carve toys now whittles a chess set from scrap wood and shared time. The knight's ears are a bit uneven. The bishop leans. No one minds. The game itself will be played between moves of a different game. The board balanced on a ration box with squares penciled in fair and faint. Toward evening, the trench falls into that gentle hour before supper, when the world seems to listen to itself. A gramophone plays something learned by heart. The needle hisses a little, and the notes climb anyway. A man with a good tenor hums along, keeping his voice under the rim of the music as if not to startle it. Conversation drifts to subjects that thrive in safe corners. A door a father made that never squeaked. A dog who could fetch slippers and a Sunday paper but not both at once. A church bell that could be heard across a frozen river. It is the museum of small certainties, open nightly. Supper comes in cans and tins, and a pot that has known many fires. A stew thickens, and the smell finds its way into sleeves and overcoat collars and the folds of letters waiting to be answered. The first spoonful is accepted with a courtesy older than armies. Salt is passed. A second helping is offered to the man who burned more calories than anyone else digging a new sump. To the engineer of dry feet, someone says, and the toast is taken in tea. Night gathers not with drama, but with patience. The sky learns its stars. Lamps are hooded. The light on faces becomes softer, and lines look less like worry and more like maps that have been folded and unfolded across years. Thomas shows you how he keeps his socks dry, as a banker shows a ledger to a clerk. He gives a pair away to a private whose feet have been wet too long. No one notices. Everyone does. There is a short drill for gas, as there must be, conducted with the same calm as a fireman's visit to a schoolhouse. Masks on, straps checked, a breath out to seat the seal. Eyes tilt to the sides, confirming by habit that a friend can see. Masks off. Coils placed precisely where hands will find them in darkness. All of it done without flourish, as ordinary as brushing crumbs from a tablecloth. Later, when the watch has been set and pages folded back into pockets, there is time for that drowsy sort of talk people have on porches. A man from Manchester explains cricket in terms that are nearly English. Someone from the coast proposes a strict scientific comparison of seaside towns, and then forgets his thesis halfway through, content to remember a pier lit by yellow bulbs and laughter that carried over water. No one asks for proof. The memory is its own witness. You attend to the small tools of bedtime, the blanket shaken and turned, the cap pulled low, the boots checked for stones and settled where fingers can find them in a hurry. A shaving brush is tucked back into its cup. A pencil is sharpened to a polite point and placed beside a notebook that will later hold lines no one else will read. If a man has a prayer, he folds himself around it and makes no announcements. If another has nothing to say to heaven tonight, he offers a last nod to his neighbor and lets that be enough. Ordinary days are not lesser days. They are the frame, the stretcher on which the canvas is stretched. Without them, nothing holds. The small actions, each precise, each decent, keep a certain kind of civilization upright when the weather of history blows hard. You think of a school teacher you once had who said that keeping your desk neat was a way of honoring the work that would be done there. This trench desk is neat now. The work tomorrow will ask much. The little things remembered tonight will quietly answer. Somewhere down the line, a cat, one of those striped philosophers who have adopted the company, slips along the duck boards with the confidence of an admiral. She pauses for a scratch and receives it, then settles near the cookhouse door as if interviewed and hired. There is a murmur of approval. A sentry shares a scrap of meat. The cat blinks twice, which in cat language is gratitude and also an oath of office. At last, the night deepens. The world reduces to what can be heard and what can be trusted. A man turns on his side. Another, already asleep, sighs in that soft way exhausted men do. Somewhere a single drop of water finds a new place to fall, and another drop follows, and then the rhythm is established. It is almost musical. It is almost peace. In pockets and under shirts, the day's missives rest. Somewhere across countries and oceans, other people blow out lamps and think of the same letters from the other side. If wishes could braid together, the sky above would be full of ropes strong enough to climb home. For now, it is enough that the ropes exist in the mind, well coiled and ready. These are the small things, the minor acts that add to a major sum. The washing of a cup, the straightening of a board, the lending of a sock, the stirring of a stew, the folding of a page. One could do worse than measure a life by such increments, or a day by such coins. The long war moves by maps, the men inside it move by teaspoons, and when the sentry taps your boot for your hour on the step, you rise as quietly as you lay down, button your coat, and take your place in the chain of ordinary care. The night ahead may hold surprises. Many nights do. But right now it offers the same view it offered the night before. A slope, a stretch of wire, the hush of fields that once were wheat. You look, you listen, you wait. It is not nothing. It is the proper work of a watchful heart. By and by, a faint breeze turns the corner of a page left open on someone's knee. You close it gently and tuck it into his pocket, as if you were putting a child's blanket back over small shoulders. There is no medal for that. There should be. Shadows of waiting weigh heavier than words. There are barriers in life that one can see and climb, and there are barriers so quiet they seem almost invisible. The men in the trench knew these silent obstacles better than anyone. They did not shout. They did not strike. They simply pressed down, day after day, until the spirit sagged under their weight. You learn quickly that the worst foes are not always bullets or shells. Sometimes they are waiting, silence, dampness, and the memory of things that cannot be touched again. The first barrier, as every man agreed, was the mud. Not the mud of a farmer's field in spring, or the brown puddles after a storm, but a thickness that swallowed boots and blurred the line between earth and water. It was mud that carried the sourness of cordite and the heavy scent of decay. Stand in it too long, and it reached for your ankles like an insistent hand, pulling until men cursed softly under their breath, tugging each foot out like an oar from sucking water. Duckboards offered some relief, but they sagged, shifted, sank. A man could be dry 1 hour and drenched to the knees the next, as if the ground itself were jealous of his comfort. You saw it in the way socks stiffened by evening, in the weary motions of men wringing them out, only to put them back damp. The medical officer said Trenchfoot was a quiet thief. It began with a tingle, then numbness, then the awful change of color, until toes looked less like toes and more like something borrowed from a wax figure. And yet the cure was so plain, dry socks, rubbed oil, rest, that it mocked the men who could not have it. To imagine losing your feet, not to battle, but to water that refused to go away, that was a cruelty the mind struggled to accept. The second barrier was the air itself. Smoke from braziers and cook fires clung to the lungs. Latrine buckets gave off fumes no man could quite forget. Above all, there was the sharp tang of gas drills, the knowledge that at any moment a cloud could slip silently over the wire and pour into the trench like an uninvited guest. Even when no gas was present, the mind created its own. A faint mist in the dawn, a curl of steam from a mug, the breath of horses far behind the line, all these could stir a shiver. Men joked about smelling gas in their dreams, but laughter did not wash it away. Then there was the sound, or rather the strange shape of silence. A barrage was dreadful. but it was also something you could name and endure. Silence, on the other hand, grew heavier with every minute. You never knew if it meant the enemy was listening, or crawling forward, or planning some trick. At night, the quiet stretched so thin that the rustle of a rat in the wire made hearts hammer. Men would cough softly, clear throats, stamp boots, anything to remind themselves that they were not alone in some vast and empty field. The silence was a presence all its own, crouching on shoulders, whispering, "Wait, wait, wait." The waiting became its own barrier. Hours stretched into days, and days blurred into weeks. Time seemed to lose its sharpness. You could not measure it by clocks, only by routines. Stand to at dawn, stand to at dusk, tea at midday, mail if you're lucky. The calendar of the trench was a cycle without holidays. Men would mark days on scraps of paper, then forget to keep count. "How long have you been here?" someone asked Thomas once. He shrugged and said, "A season, maybe 2. In truth, it had been 14 months. The body kept count in aches. The soul lost track. Another quiet obstacle was the lice. They were not large, not dramatic, not even particularly dangerous in themselves, but they never left. They lived in seams of trousers, in collars of shirts, in folds of blankets. Men could spend an entire hour picking them off, crushing them between fingernails, and still find more later. The itching was maddening. Some men laughed about it. Others grew pale with frustration, scratching until skin bled. The lice did not retreat even from fire. Hold a candle to the seams, and you might hear the faint pop of eggs bursting, but the survivors would return, as sure as the rain. The trench curse, the men called it. A barrier not of stone or iron, but of patience. The last and perhaps deepest barrier was the memory of normal life. In letters from home, wives spoke of gardens, mothers of laundry, friends of dances or market days. To read such lines by candlelight in a damp dugout was to press your nose against glass you could not break. The longing hurt, and yet you could not put the letters away. They were too dear, too needed. Men found themselves whispering aloud words meant for them alone, as if to feel the voices in the air. But the letters also built a wall. You remembered how things once were, and in remembering you touched the cruel truth of how they were not now. What made these barriers so powerful was that they did not announce themselves. No bugle, no warning. They simply settled into the bones. A man might look whole and still be hollowed. He might talk as usual, but his eyes carried the weight of barriers invisible. And when the time came for action, when whistles blew and ladders were climbed, he carried these unseen burdens into battle as surely as he carried his rifle. Thomas once put it in his own dry way. "We don't fight only the Germans," he said one evening, turning a tin cup in his hands. "We fight the waiting. We fight the itch. We fight the cold. We fight not knowing when it ends." He looked into the cup as though it might answer him. Strange army, isn't it? The enemy in front, the enemy in the seams, the enemy in the ground itself. Yet within all these barriers, men continued. They shaved in cracked mirrors, patched sandbags, swapped socks, shared tea, told jokes about biscuits hard enough to break teeth. The barriers pressed down, but never wholly flattened. Every small act, a letter read aloud, a spoonful of jam offered, a cigarette shared, was a way of climbing over, if only for a minute. It is perhaps the most human truth of those days. The barriers did not vanish, but neither did the men. They endured both. And in the quiet, where the silence grew heavy, they learned to wait together. A friend's quiet presence steadies the moment. There is a saying among old soldiers that a man does not truly know himself until he has seen his own reflection in another's eyes. In the trenches, that reflection often came not from glass, for mirrors were rare and cracked, but from the faces of comrades sitting shoulder to shoulder, shoulder in the muck. To live in that narrow strip of earth was to live among men so closely that your own soul seemed echoed back to you in their habits, their words, their fears. Take Thomas, the corporal with the Manchester accent. His face was worn into deep creases by smoke, wind, and fatigue, yet behind his roughness there was an odd gentleness. One evening, as the trench settled into dusk, you caught him staring across the parapet at nothing in particular. His hands rested on his knees, a cigarette smoldering between his fingers. You wondered what he was thinking, and then he muttered, half to himself, "It's the waiting that eats a man." Hearing those words, you realized they were your own thought as well, only spoken aloud by another mouth. A reflection, plain and undeniable. Such reflections were everywhere. The man beside you cursed the mud in the exact words you had silently cursed it an hour earlier. The fellow across the trench nursed a letter from home with the same reverent care you had given yours. When one man laughed too loudly at a weak joke, it was often because everyone else was afraid of the silence too. The trench did not leave room for secrets. Whatever you carried inside showed itself sooner or later, mirrored in the faces of those who shared your narrow world. Sometimes the reflection comforted, other times it unsettled. You might notice the tremor in another man's hands when shells began to fall and recognize it in your own fingers. You might see the 1,000-yard stare in his eyes and know, with a chill, that the same stare lived in you. Men spoke little about fear, but they did not need to. It was plain enough in the reflections, and in that unspoken acknowledgement, some measure of relief came. If he feels it too, you thought, then perhaps I am not weak. The trench provided endless small portraits of humanity, each man a kind of mirror. There was the boyish private who hummed a tune from home, soft and steady, as though music could weave a cocoon around him. You found yourself humming along one night, surprising even your own ears. There was the tall sergeant who polished his boots long after shine no longer mattered, and you saw in his ritual your own stubbornness about folding letters just so. These quirks, repeated and recognized, made you feel less like a stranger to yourself. In quieter hours, reflections deepened into companionship. One cold afternoon, rain dripping steadily from sandbags above, Thomas leaned back against the trench wall and asked, "What's your home like?" The question was simple, yet startling. You described a small kitchen with a window that looked onto apple trees, and how in late summer the air filled with wasps drawn by fallen fruit. Thomas listened, nodding, then told you about Manchester streets thick with mill smoke and the sound of looms hammering late into the night. The worlds were different, yet the act of sharing them made the trench seem briefly wider. Each man's memory became a mirror for the other, reflecting not just survival, but the lives that had been set aside. Not all reflections were tender. Anger found its echo too. A careless remark, a harsh laugh at the wrong moment, and tempers flared. Yet even in quarrels, men often discovered their own frustrations staring back at them, magnified in the heat of words. Quarrels rarely lasted. In a place where death could arrive unannounced, grudges felt foolish. Soon enough, the reflection of anger faded into the reflection of forgiveness, spoken or unspoken. One of the most startling reflections came during Stand 2 at dawn. The sky was a smear of gray, the ground slick with dew. As you leaned on the fire step, rifle in hand, you glanced at the man beside you. His face was pale in the half-light, his jaw tight. For a moment, you felt as though you were staring into a mirror, your own dread painted on his features. He noticed your glance, and the corner of his mouth lifted, a wry, weary smile. Without a word, you smiled back. The exchange lasted seconds, but in it lay a profound recognition. We are the same, you and I, walking the same narrow edge. The soldiers often joked that the trench was like a family home, though with less comfort and more mud. Brothers, they called one another, sometimes in jest, sometimes in earnest. Yet the word fit. Brothers not by birth, but by reflection, each man holding up a fragment of the other's soul. You did not need to love every comrade. You only needed to recognize yourself in him, and him in you. That recognition was enough to bind you, stronger than orders or pay. Reflections came even from the enemy. Now and then, when the guns fell silent, you caught glimpses of German soldiers across no man's land. They moved with the same weary slouch, smoked in the same huddled way, ducked the same when shells cracked overhead. Through binoculars or periscope, you saw not faceless enemies, but tired men who mirrored your own exhaustion. A strange comfort, though one you dared not voice too loudly. To see yourself in the adversary was to admit the futility of the struggle. Still, the reflection was there, undeniable. Even the land reflected you. Pools of water, still as glass between bombardments, showed faces smeared with grime and shadows. Men leaned over them, not to admire, but to confront. "That's me?" they muttered. Hollow cheeks, eyes ringed with sleeplessness, beards grown patchy. It was a harsher reflection, but still a mirror, reminding each man of the changes wrought by weeks in the mud. Some spat into the water, turning away. Others lingered, curious at how war had reshaped them. The most human reflections, though, came in the smallest acts. A hand reaching to steady another as he climbed a slippery duckboard. A joke told in precisely the moment silence threatened to break a man. A shared cigarette glowing faintly in the dark. Each act was both given and returned, mirrored in kindness. If despair pressed too hard, it was often softened by these reflections of care. The war demanded much, but in its strange way it gave this: the chance to see yourself in others, unvarnished and clear. For some, it was a comfort. For others, a haunting. Yet for all, it was a truth. Alone, a man could break. Reflected, he endured. Hidden struggles slip beneath daily habits. Every trench had its burdens, and every man carried them quietly. Outwardly, life moved with the same rhythm. Stand to at dawn, a mug of tea if fortune allowed, a patrol, a meal of bully beef, then hours of waiting. But beneath these rituals flowed hidden struggles that no roll call or inspection could quite measure. It was here, in the smallest habits, that the key to endurance often lay. The day might begin with something as ordinary as lacing boots. To tie the stiff, mud-caked leather was to prepare not only the body, but also the mind. Many men whispered a phrase as they pulled the laces tight, words no one else could hear. A prayer, a memory of home, a private bargain with themselves. These murmured rituals were not shared openly, yet they gave shape to the day. No man would have admitted it was a kind of charm, but each felt steadier afterward, as though hidden order had been restored to a disordered world. Another quiet struggle lay in food. The rations were rarely enough to satisfy, and monotony weighed heavier than hunger. Jam tasted of glue, biscuits could crack teeth, and bully beef carried its own sour tang. Yet men found keys to make even this bearable. One would trade a portion of meat for an extra biscuit. Another would scrape away mold with the tip of his knife and joke about it being extra flavor. In these small exchanges, the act of control mattered more than the food itself. To choose, however little, was to reclaim something from a war that chose almost everything for you. Letters, too, were keys to survival. A folded sheet of paper carried warmth across miles of battlefield, but each letter also carried danger, for within its lines could lie both comfort and grief. One soldier, eyes shining, read aloud how his daughter had taken her first steps. Another, silent, folded a letter reporting illness back home and tucked it into his tunic. He never spoke of it, but in the way his shoulders sagged you could read the weight. The key, in such moments, was the ritual of rereading. Good letters were read until the paper frayed, becoming talismans that steadied the hand. Hard letters were smoothed again and again until grief dulled into something manageable. Cleanliness, or the search for it, was another hidden battle. A tin of water, barely enough to wet a cloth, became a tool of dignity. A man might wash his face with meticulous care, scraping with a blunt razor, even if mud covered everything else. To shave was to say, "I am still myself." And when a neighbor teased him for vanity, he only smiled, for the teasing itself was a sign of humanity. To resist filth, even in small ways, was to resist despair. Then there was the struggle against the constant company of death. Rats feasted in plain sight, and sometimes a body lay too close to the parapet to be moved. A new recruit once stared so long at a corpse that Thomas nudged him sharply. "Don't let it fix you," he said. "See it, nod to it, then carry on." That was his key. Acknowledgement, not denial, and then the deliberate choice to look away. Others used humor. Men joked that the rats deserved medals for bravery, feeding so fearlessly between shells. The joke was dark, but it gave them control, turning horror into something that could be spoken of without breaking. The hardest struggle of all was the weight of tomorrow. Orders could come at any time. A raid at midnight, an advance at dawn, a wiring party under moonlight. The anticipation gnawed. And yet, men learned keys to unlock their fear. One wrote letters before each stand-to, sealing them in case he did not return. Another carved small figures from shell fragments, each stroke of the knife pulling his thoughts away from what lay ahead. Some sought the key in faith, fingering rosaries or medals. Others found it in superstition. A certain cap angle, a lucky coin, a whispered phrase. None of it guaranteed safety, but all of it offered a sense of balance. In these hidden struggles, the trench revealed its strangest truth. The great battles were fought with rifles and shells, but the quiet battles were fought in the privacy of habit. To fold a blanket carefully, to polish a rifle even when mud would soil it again in minutes, to share a cigarette with the man beside you. These were victories against despair. They did not make the war shorter, but they made the waiting bearable. And so, each man carried his key. Some wore it around their neck, others kept it tucked inside the heart. It was not always the same shape, sometimes a word, sometimes a gesture, sometimes a fragment of memory. But whatever form it took, it unlocked the strength to step once more into the day, to lift a boot from the mud, to shoulder the rifle again. Sharing bread softens the longest hours. It was said, quietly and without ceremony, that the real wealth of the trenches was not measured in medals or rations, but in the ability to share. In a place where comfort was scarce, even a crust of bread became more than food. It became a bond, an act of defiance against the mud, the fear, the endless sameness of days. Morning came often with drizzle. The trench, already soft from weeks of rain, seemed to melt beneath boots. Duckboards floated loose, threatening to tip men into pools of stagnant water. The cook, shielded behind a sheet of tin hammered into a rough shelter, ladled out porridge that tasted of smoke and grit. Beside him, another soldier sliced bread from loaves that had traveled miles from the rear. Some were moldy at the edges, green speckling the crust, but no one complained. A scrap of bread, even sour, meant another thread tying a man to normal life. Thomas, always practical, tore his piece in half. He handed one portion across without looking, as though embarrassed by his own generosity. The man beside him accepted silently, nodding once. No thanks were spoken. The act itself was thanks enough. Around the trench, similar exchanges unfolded. Crumbs pressed into another's hand, a crust tucked into a pocket for a comrade who had been too ill to line up. Each gesture was small, but together they wove a quiet web of survival. Bread was more than nourishment. It was memory. A slice reminded one man of his mother's kitchen, where flour dusted the table and the smell of yeast filled the air. Another recalled the warmth of a bakery in the early hours before work, the glow of ovens spilling into dark streets. Each bite carried a whisper of home, a world far removed from the thunder of shells. In chewing, men closed their eyes, letting the taste bridge the gap between mud and memory. There were stories, too, about bread. Old soldiers passed them down like folklore. One claimed that a loaf had once stopped a bullet, the round lodged deep in the crust. Another swore that the Germans envied British bread so much that they traded cigarettes for it during a brief lull. These tales were half-truths, perhaps, but no one cared. They gave the bread a mythic quality, turning each loaf into more than flour and water. At night, when rations ran thin, the sharing of bread became ritual. A man might break off the softest center of his slice and press it into another's hand with a muttered, "Here, you'll need it more." Sometimes the exchange came with humor. "Eat it before the rats do," one fellow would joke, tossing a chunk across the trench. Laughter softened hunger, and even the rats, fat and bold, became part of the strange theater of trench life. There were darker moments as well. Once, a young soldier, desperate from days of half rations, hoarded his bread under his coat. When discovered, shame flushed his face deeper than the mud on his boots. But instead of anger, the others divided their portions with him anyway. "Next time, just ask," Thomas said simply. The boy nodded, eyes lowered, learning the lesson that survival was never solitary. Bread revealed character. Some gave easily, others clung. But over time, even the most guarded learned the value of a shared crust. In the silence after bombardments, when nerves trembled and ears rang, a man might pass his last piece along, saying nothing. The act was enough. It was an offering, not to God or king, but to the man beside him, the one who would, in turn, keep watch, lift him from mud, or drag him back from no man's land. And so bread became a symbol. Not grand, not noble, but practical and human. It was torn by hand, passed palm to palm, eaten quickly before dampness spoiled it. Yet in that simplicity lay something extraordinary. Bread softened hours that would otherwise have stretched, unbearable. Bread bound men to each other in ways orders could not. Bread, humble and imperfect, reminded them all that they were still human in a place designed to strip humanity away. Fear rises softly, like mist before dawn. Even in a place as weary and battered as the front, there were moments when the air itself seemed to gather weight, as though the world were holding its breath. These were not the roaring bombardments, not the sudden gas alarms, but something subtler, a quiet surge that came before the storm. Men felt it in their bones, long before officers whispered the orders. A tension that needed no trumpet call. It might begin in the hush of an afternoon, when the guns at last fell silent. Silence in the trenches was rarely a gift. It meant someone, somewhere, was preparing. The birds might dare to sing for a moment, their fragile notes carried across no man's land. But men did not smile at it. They only glanced at one another, brows furrowed, hands restless upon rifles. The quiet stretched like a string pulled too tight. Thomas once said he could taste it. Like iron in the air, he muttered, licking cracked lips. Like before a storm. He was not alone. Old veterans sensed patterns. They knew the rhythm of shell fire, the lulls, the habits of the enemy opposite. When that rhythm broke, unease seeped in. No one spoke of it openly. But men shifted, adjusted straps, checked gas masks again, even when they'd checked them already. Boots scraped softly, duckboards creaked. Tiny sounds, each betraying the mind's restlessness. The quiet surge was not only fear of attack, it was also the fear of orders. A runner could arrive at any hour, bearing the folded slip that said simply, "At dawn, advance." Such words, when read, changed everything. The trench might appear the same, the mud, the sandbags, the rats, but suddenly it was not shelter. It was the edge of something vast and terrible. The men who knew leaned against the walls, faces turned away, hiding thoughts they could not voice. That night before, conversation grew strange. Some spoke too loudly, laughing at jokes too thin. Others grew silent, polishing rifles with endless care. A man might take out a letter and stare at it without reading, lips moving silently in some half-prayer. Another might count cartridges again and again, as if numbers alone could steady the heart. The quiet surge did not roar. It pressed down gently, suffocating in its softness. Sleep was a poor refuge. In the dugouts, men tossed and shifted, listening for every scrape. The drip of water seemed louder, the rats' squeals sharper. When exhaustion pulled eyelids down, dreams rushed in. Dreams of running and never arriving, of climbing ladders only to find the sky filled with fire. Many woke with a start, palms damp, clutching at blankets as if they might be dragged away. No man mocked another for this. It was too common, too near to his own truth. As dawn approached, the surge reached its peak. Officers moved like shadows, voices low. Stand to. Men lined the fire step, bayonets fixed. Across no man's land, a pale mist rose, curling like smoke from unseen chimneys. Eyes strained to pierce it, to find movement. The mist was only mist, but the mind made shapes in it, advancing lines, figures crouched low, enemies where none yet stood. The trigger finger twitched, waiting for certainty that never quite came. And still, the attack might not arrive. Sometimes the quiet surge ended with nothing more than a few shells, a scattered rifle shot, a distant shout. The relief was thin, almost bitter. For in the silence afterward, the heart still raced, the hands still trembled, and the knowledge settled deep. Next time, it would not be a false alarm. The shock of trench life lay not only in what happened, but in what almost happened, what could happen, what hovered just beyond the mist. The quiet surge was the body's memory of danger, bracing itself in advance. It was the mind's rehearsal for losses yet to come. And it was, strangely, one of the ties that bound men together. For in those moments, every soldier felt the same invisible weight pressing against his chest. They stood shoulder to shoulder, not because orders demanded it, but because no one could face that waiting alone. A kindness offered warms more than skin. Kindness in the trenches was not loud. It did not arrive with fanfare or speeches. It came quietly, like a hand reaching in the dark, like steam rising from a tin mug, like a blanket passed without a word. These moments never filled the official reports, but they were the stitches that kept a soldier's spirit from unraveling. The cold was the truest enemy, perhaps even more than bullets. Dampness crept into every seam, every sock, every blanket. It lived in the dugouts, dripping from beams, seeping through sandbags, clinging to the very bones. Men cursed the mud, but they feared the cold. For cold did not kill suddenly. It gnawed, hour after hour, turning toes black, stiffening fingers, dulling thoughts until even a match seemed impossible to strike. And so, kindness often took the shape of warmth. One man might pour his ration of tea into another's mug when he saw him shivering too hard to hold his own. Another might shift closer in the dugout, pressing shoulders together, letting body heat pass between them like a secret. A soldier might even offer dry socks, precious beyond gold. Thomas once gave his only spare pair to a young lad whose feet had begun to swell. "You'll lose less this way," he said simply, tugging them on for him, rubbing the boy's heels with rough hands until color returned. There was kindness in sound as well. After a bombardment, when ears rang and nerves shook, a veteran might hum softly, an old hymn or a tune from the music halls. No one asked him to, and few joined in. But the hum anchored the air, reminding frightened men that voices still lived among the thunder. Sometimes, after the humming ended, a chuckle would follow, a joke about the rats, about the endless bully beef, about the sergeant's bark. Humor was a kind of kindness, offering release where words of comfort might fail. Letters, too, carried kindness between men. Some could not read, their schooling cut short before the war. Others were too shaken to hold pen steady, and so comrades read aloud for them, slowly, carefully, without mocking a mispronounced word. They answered too, scratching replies that spoke of love and reassurance in plain language. "Your boy is fine," Thomas once wrote on behalf of another. "He misses you." The man who received that letter wept, clutching it as though it were life itself. The trenches made men equal in ways the world behind the lines never had. Class faded when a man wrapped another's feet in bandages, or when he cut half his bread to give away. The accents of Manchester, London, Glasgow, and Dublin mixed together like threads woven tight by necessity. In ordinary life, they might never have spoken. In the mud, they shared cigarettes end to end, the ember glowing between lips, a fragile chain of fire against the damp. Kindness appeared, even in the darkest humor. When a comrade was too frightened to climb the fire step, another might slap his back and mutter, "If you're too slow, the rats will get the good bits first." Cruel in words, but softened in tone, it broke the spell of terror long enough for the man to step forward. Beneath the laughter lay understanding, a recognition of shared fear that needed no confession. There was also the kindness of remembering. In the midst of endless days, a man might note quietly that it was another's birthday. He would carve a stub of candle from his kit, stick it in a lump of bread, and light it with care. Men would laugh at the absurdity, yet cheer anyway, voices ragged but warm. For a few minutes, war bent back, and the trench became a dining room, crude and holy in its way. The officers, too, sometimes showed their share. A lieutenant might step aside, allowing his men the larger share of rum, or he might quietly turn a blind eye when a soldier pocketed an extra biscuit. These gestures, small and rare, carried more weight than orders shouted at dawn. They proved that even within the rigid walls of rank, kindness still found cracks to seep through. It was not all grand, nor all noble. Sometimes kindness meant nothing more than a soldier holding his tin mug steady so his mate could drink without spilling, or placing a helmet over a sleeping comrade's face to keep the rats away, or saving the last drag of a cigarette and offering it with a grin, as though the ember itself were treasure. In truth, kindness was the only warmth that did not fade. Fires died quickly, blankets rotted in damp, rum ran out. But the memory of a hand on the shoulder, of bread divided in silence, of a joke shared under fire, these lingered. They became the secret fuel that carried men through the next hour, the next night, the next unthinkable day. And so, when the trench seemed darkest, when even the stars above appeared cold, the smallest kindness could glow like a lantern. A soldier would carry it quietly, tucked deep in the heart, and let it burn against the long chill of war. In the stillness, eyes learned to see shadows. Night in the trenches did not arrive with comfort. It slid in like a cold sheet, heavy and damp, pressing itself against every wall of earth, against every weary back. Daylight offered at least the illusion of safety, the thin comfort of seeing danger approach. But night was different. Night wrapped itself around a man and left him with his thoughts, his fears, and the endless duty of watching. The order came softly, almost ritual. Sentry duty, 2 hours on, 2 off. And so, men took their turns on the fire step, peering across no man's land into darkness that seemed alive. The silence was never complete. There was always a drip from some corner, a scurry of a rat, the low rumble of distant guns. Yet it was the silence between those sounds that mattered, the gaps where the mind painted threats. A snapping twig could become a raiding party. A drifting shadow could be a German crawling closer, knife in hand. For the sentry, the world narrowed. His boots sank into duckboards slick with slime. His rifle pressed cool and solid against his palms. His breath hung faint in the air, catching the glow of a hidden candle or a smoldering cigarette. He was alone, even with comrades close at hand, for sentry duty was a solitary burden. No one else could keep his eyes open. No one else could decide whether a movement was real or imagined. Some learned tricks to stay sharp. Veterans never stared at one spot too long, for the eyes, weary, would conjure phantoms. Instead, they let their gaze wander slowly, sweeping from wire to crater to wire again, steady as a pendulum. Others hummed softly under their breath, a tune that kept them tethered to the moment. A few pinched their own arms or shifted weight from one foot to the other, tiny movements that staved off the heaviness of sleep. Sleep was the greatest danger of the watch. Exhaustion hung over every man like another layer of mud. Hours of labor, of bombardment, of fear left bodies craving rest, and the fire step was no place for rest. Yet more than one soldier had nodded, just once, just for a heartbeat, and paid dearly. A sentry asleep could mean the whole trench caught unready. The punishment for such failure was brutal, sometimes death by firing squad. But worse still was the knowledge that comrades had been left unguarded, exposed to the unseen. And so, men fought sleep with desperate devotion. They whispered to each other, short and low. "You awake?" One would murmur to the man a few yards down. "Aye." That single syllable, enough to tether them both. A reassurance that they were not quite alone in the blackness. Sometimes they shared stories in fragments. One sentence carried over the dark. "My dog kept pigeons." A pause, then, "Mine had a horse." Not a conversation, not really, but a thread stretching between two minds, pulling them both through the watch. There was always the chance of flares. Without warning, the sky would erupt in a burst of white, turning no man's land into a frozen stage. Every blade of wire gleamed silver, every crater etched in sharp relief, and every man froze, becoming stone, breath caught, heart hammering. In that merciless light, shadows betrayed movement. If you twitched, if you shifted, you might be seen, and if you were seen, bullets followed. When the flare burned out, darkness returned thicker than before, swallowing all. The sentry's eyes, dazzled, would ache, and he would begin again the slow sweep of shadows. The worst moments were the false alarms, a rustle in the wire, a figure low to the ground, and then nothing. A rat, a drifting piece of cloth, a trick of the mist. Shots fired, men awakened, tension sharpened, and nothing. Yet each false alarm was better than missing the real thing, and so the watch went on, filled with these quiet panics. Sometimes there was music, carried faintly over the lines, drifting from the German side, a harmonica, perhaps, or a low chorus of voices. The sound was soft, uncanny, almost humanizing. One could not hate a voice singing, not fully. For a moment, sentries leaned their chins on their rifles and listened, remembering music halls, warm parlors, Sunday services. Then the song faded, and the war reclaimed the night. Sentries saw things others did not. They knew the outline of every crater, the lean of every blasted tree. They could tell, at a glance, if a shadow was new, if wire had been cut, if a mound had shifted. Their memories became maps, etched deep in weary eyes. And when the relief came, when another took the step and the watch was past, it felt like releasing a weight heavy as the sky itself. The silent watch was never truly silent. It was filled with the soft sounds of endurance. Boots shifting, hearts beating, whispers carrying. Yet it was in that silence that men proved themselves. Not by charging bravely, not by killing, but by standing steady through hours when nothing happened, and knowing that, at any second, everything could. Ink on paper held a soldier's heartbeat. In the trenches, paper was more than paper. It was a doorway, a rope stretched across miles, binding mud-soaked men to kitchens, gardens, and faces they feared they might never see again. Letters were lifelines. They arrived in bundles, carried by clerks who waded through mud with sacks strapped to their shoulders, each envelope trembling with hope. When mail was announced, the trench changed. Men straightened as though the weight of exhaustion had lifted for a moment. Some tried to mask their eagerness, standing casually, but their eyes betrayed them, fixed on the sergeant's hands, on the precious stack. Names were called, one by one, each syllable carrying a flicker of relief. Taylor, Thompson, McBride. A man who heard his name would smile, shy and fleeting, and tuck the letter close to his chest before daring to read. A man who did not would look away, pretending it mattered little. But it mattered. Silence in the mail could feel sharper than shrapnel. Opening a letter was a ritual. Some tore eagerly, devouring each word. Others held back, savoring the moment, touching the envelope's edge as if reluctant to disturb it. And when they read, their faces softened in ways the trenches rarely allowed. Mud and fear fell away for a moment, replaced by a boyish grin, or sometimes a trembling lip. The contents varied, yet always carried weight. A mother's handwriting, shaky but firm. "We miss you at supper." A child's clumsy scrawl, crooked letters. "Papa, come home soon." A sweetheart's careful words. "I think of you every night when the wind rattles the windows." These lines became more than ink. They became warmth itself, warming the soldier's pocket long after the reading. Men shared too. Illiterates would hand over their envelopes, trusting a comrade to read aloud. The reader's voice would soften, respectful, carrying every syllable with dignity. The listener's eyes would close, lips shaping words silently as if repeating them in prayer. Replies, too, were often shared tasks. A man with steady hand and clear script would write for another, crafting lines that reassured mothers, sweethearts, wives. He is well. He misses you. He thinks of home often. The truth inside those letters was never the full truth. Few wrote of gas clouds, of rats, of comrades lost in shell fire. Instead, they wrote of health, of resilience, of small comforts. I have dry socks today. I had hot tea this morning. Not lies exactly, but a careful trimming of reality, designed to spare the reader's heart. Soldiers knew the power of words, and they carried the burden of protecting their loved ones from horrors too raw to cross oceans. Sometimes letters arrived with tokens: a pressed flower, brittle yet fragrant, a lock of hair tied with ribbon, a photograph folded at the corners, smudged by countless touches. These were treasures beyond measure. A photograph of a child, gap-toothed and smiling, could pull tears from the sternest corporal. A flower might be tucked into the lining of a helmet, a charm against death. These tokens gave men something solid to hold when words blurred under weary eyes. There were also packages, socks knitted by hands far away, their stitches uneven but filled with care. A cake wrapped in brown paper, sometimes crumbling by the time it reached the trench, but still eaten with reverence. Tobacco tins, chocolates, small luxuries that turned into communal feasts. A single bar of chocolate might be cut into squares, each man savoring his portion as though it were holy bread. And there was humor too. Letters brought gossip from home, news of neighbors' quarrels, of harvests, of new shops on the high street. One soldier laughed for an hour after reading that his sister had painted the family's front door a shocking blue. "Wait until Da sees it," he chuckled, repeating the line again and again. For a time, the trench became a parlor, filled with chuckles and muttered jokes. But not all letters brought joy. Some carried the weight of loss. A black-bordered envelope was dreaded. Men who received them often read in silence, eyes fixed and empty. Others gathered round quietly, not with words, but with presence, offering a hand on the shoulder. A cigarette passed without asking. Grief in the trenches was private, yet never solitary. Even those who could not speak shared the burden. The act of writing back was its own ritual. Men hunched over scraps of paper, shielding them from rain with helmets, writing by candlelight or flare glow. They wrote about comrades by name, about the weather, about the food. They promised to be careful, to stay strong. And between the lines, they tucked small truths of love, of longing, of the ache of distance. "I dream of our kitchen," one man wrote, "the smell of bread in the oven." When paper ran out, men wrote on whatever they could, the back of a ration label, a corner of a map. Words mattered more than medium. Even a smudge of pencil on scrap carried a world of meaning. Letters traveled slowly, sometimes weeks or months. A man might die before his words arrived home. A mother might write to a son already buried in foreign soil. Yet the letters moved, carried by endless hands, across seas and fields, stitched into the fabric of the war. They were the pulse of connection in a place designed to sever it. And so, letters became both anchor and sail. They tethered soldiers to the past, to hearth and family. They also pulled them forward, giving reason to endure, to live long enough to read the next envelope, to write the next reply. In the trenches, where the future was a fog and the past a fading echo. The thin weight of an envelope became a promise that home still existed, and that a man might one day return to it. Time itself weighed heavier than rifles. If there was one enemy every soldier knew well, it was waiting. Not the sharp terror of bombardment, not the scramble of a raid, but the long, heavy hours that stretched between. Waiting filled the trenches like mist, seeping into bones, dulling senses, and grinding men down in ways more subtle than shrapnel ever could. From the moment a soldier rose at dawn to the moment his eyes closed in the dugout, waiting framed his existence. He waited for rations, for orders, for relief, for mail, for the shell that might or might not fall. And though each hour seemed the same, the weight of anticipation made time feel like another trench wall pressing close, narrower with every passing day. Morning brought the first stretch of waiting. Stand 2, at dawn, rifles loaded, eyes fixed on no man's land. 2 hours of breath held, expecting an attack that might never come. If nothing stirred, relief came with a sigh, but not joy. It was only the beginning of another day. The men climbed down from the fire step, rubbed hands together, muttered about tea, and returned to the deeper wait. During the day, waiting came in quieter shapes. A corporal sent a party to mend duckboards, filling sandbags, patching collapsed walls. The labor was heavy, but even in work there was waiting. Every shovel of mud was a pause between shell bursts. Every lifted plank was a heartbeat stretched long, ears straining for the sound of incoming fire. Even when nothing happened, the expectation that something could happen hung in the air, making each action feel suspended. Some men found ways to endure it. They carved. A shell casing might become a vase, a bullet turned into a pencil. A knife whittled patterns into wood pulled from ruined barns. Others wrote letters, not because they had news, but because the act itself filled time. We had stew today. The weather turned cold. Small details, inked out slowly, stretched into paragraphs. It was less about content than about shaping hours into something tangible. Card games were another refuge, a deck, greasy with mud and fingerprints, passed from hand to hand. The slap of cards against ammo boxes made a rhythm, punctuating silence. Bets were made with cigarettes, with promises, with imaginary coins. Arguments flared, but they burned quickly, as no one truly wanted to fight over illusions. The game wasn't about winning. It was about passing the time that would otherwise sit heavy. Yet waiting was not always dull. Sometimes it was edged with dread. Men learned to recognize the moments when quiet turned dangerous. A lull in shell fire could mean the enemy was preparing. A sudden absence of movement across no man's land could signal something brewing. Then waiting became electric, every sense sharp, every glance over the parapet longer. Hours passed with hearts beating fast, as if an attack were already upon them. And when no attack came, the tension drained slowly, leaving exhaustion deeper than any labor. There was the waiting for mail, too. At midday, when the clerk came shuffling with his sack, the trench held its breath. Names were read, hands stretched out, some filled with envelopes, others left empty. For the man without a letter, the waiting continued, stretching into another day of silence from home. For the lucky one, the letter was read again and again, filling hours with the repetition of familiar words. The night was the longest wait of all. In the dugouts, men lay shoulder to shoulder, staring at the earthen roof, listening for the scrape of boots above, the hiss of gas shells, the whistle of incoming fire. 2 hours of sentry duty passed like a lifetime, and yet, when the next watch came, the relief was small, A man crawled into his dugout and lay still. But his body remained alert, waiting still, even in half-sleep. Dreams were only another form of waiting, waiting for morning, for news, for the next burst of chaos. The cruelest waiting was for orders. Rumors swirled. We're going over tomorrow. Relief is coming. A push at dawn. Each rumor settled into men's minds, gnawed at them, and then proved false. The waiting stretched longer, and yet, when the real orders finally came, the shock was worse. All that anticipation did not prepare the heart. It only frayed it. Men who had waited weeks for a push still trembled when told to climb the ladders. Some learned to live inside waiting. Thomas, grizzled from 14 months in the line, once said, "Best not to count hours. Think in moments. A cigarette smoked, a mug of tea, a dry pair of socks. Stack those one atop another, and you'll find you've made it through the day." His advice carried truth. To think too far ahead was to drown in the endless sea of time. To live only in minutes kept a man afloat. The waiting bred superstition too. Some tapped helmets 3 times before stepping on duty. Others saved a last sip of tea before sleep, as if holding back a token against the night. These rituals gave the illusion of control in a world where hours were otherwise meaningless. And yet, amid the monotony, waiting had its mercies. It gave space for friendship to bloom. Men talked softly during long stretches, about fields at home, about sisters' weddings, about a book read years before. In the waiting, they built bonds stronger than any formed in haste. Bonds that held when shells fell, when charges came. Waiting was heavy, yes, but it was also what shaped them. It was the crucible in which patience, resilience, and quiet humor formed. Without it, the shocks of combat might have broken them outright. With it, they learned to endure not only the bursts of violence, but the long silences between. At dawn, silence held more weight than steel. Every day in the trenches began with the same ritual, a ceremony of tension that soldiers called simply "stand to." It was an old habit, drilled into them by officers who knew well the patterns of war. Dawn and dusk were the hours of danger, the moments when shadows blurred the eye and the mind grew sluggish. At these edges of day, men were most vulnerable, and so they were summoned to stand together, rifles in hand, hearts beating as one. The order always came quietly, whispered along the line so as not to carry to the enemy. "Stand to." It slipped down the trench like a shiver, waking men from shallow sleep, drawing them out of dugouts into the gray. Boots squelched in mud, helmets were tugged into place, rifles lifted, bayonets fixed. No one needed reminding. Every man knew what this meant. The trench at dawn was a world between worlds. Darkness clung stubbornly, yet a thin line of light spread across the horizon. The earth smelled damp, almost metallic, from the night's dew. A faint mist hung over no man's land, softening the jagged wreckage of barbed wire and broken posts. In that mist, every shape looked alive. Was that a tree stump or a man? A shadow or a raiding party? The silence deepened the uncertainty. Each soldier stood on the fire step, peering through the parapet, every sense sharpened. Their fingers rested near triggers, their breath slowed. The silence was thick enough to press against skin. In those moments, men were not individuals. They were one long line of waiting, bound together by discipline and fear. Sometimes, nothing came. The mist lifted, the sky grew brighter, and with the sun's rise, the order was given. Stand down. Relief rippled quietly, shoulders sagging, rifles lowered. Men stepped down, rubbed their arms, stretched aching legs. But the silence of that hour remained etched in memory, heavy even when no attack followed. Other times, The silence shattered. Flares hissed into the sky, bathing no man's land in harsh white light. A machine gun chattered from the other side, bullets snapping through mist. Men fired back, eyes stinging from sudden brightness. The calm that had seemed eternal dissolved into chaos within a heartbeat. That was why stand to mattered. It was the thin line between survival and surprise. The ritual carried a rhythm that shaped life. A man might be bone-weary, eyes burning from a night's wiring party or sentry duty, but he would still drag himself up for stand to. No excuses. To miss it was to risk the lives of everyone, and so even when bodies begged for rest, men obeyed. There was comfort in the sameness, in knowing that at dawn and dusk all would stand together. It was also a time for reflection. Men spoke little, for voices carried, but their minds wandered. Many thought of home, imagining the same dawn light falling on fields, on cottages, on kitchens far away. A soldier from Yorkshire once whispered to his mate, "My mother will be lighting the stove now. Smell of bacon, I can near taste it." In those words, the trench felt less distant, if only for a breath. For some, stand to became prayer. Lips moved silently, words shaped in ritual, asking for one more day of life. Some crossed themselves, others clutched medals tucked under tunics. Faith was not uniform, but the act of hoping was shared. In the hush, the prayers of hundreds seemed to mingle, a quiet chorus rising with the mist. The officers walked the line, checking rifles, masks, and bayonets. They too stood in silence, their young faces worn by years older than their age. They bore the weight of knowing that if an attack came, they must be the first to move, the first to shout, to lead. In the hush, even their authority felt fragile, humbled by the vastness of the waiting. Stand to was not only about vigilance. It was a statement to the enemy, unseen but listening. A line of men ready at the edge of dawn meant strength, meant preparedness. The Germans across no man's land performed their own version of the ritual. Two lines of men, each invisible to the other, stood in silence, both fearing, both waiting, both wondering if the other would move first. It was a strange symmetry. Enemies bound by the same dawn, the same fear, the same stillness. Afterward, when the order to stand down came, men often moved in unison toward the small comforts of morning. Tea brewed in battered cans, poured steaming into tin mugs. Cigarettes lit, smoke curling into air that smelled less threatening now. Bread shared, jam spread thinly. The hush gave way to murmurs, laughter, the scrape of spoons against bowls. Life returned, as though the silence had been a dream. But for some, the silence lingered. It was not easily shaken. They remembered the way the mist looked, the way their hearts had beat in unison, the way the world had felt both endless and terribly small. For them, Stand To became a symbol of the war itself. A hush before chaos, a pause filled with weight, a moment when men stood side by side not knowing what would follow. Stories were told of the rare stand-tos when something unexpected happened. Once, in a quiet sector, as men stood in stillness, a German voice drifted through the mist. "Morning, Tommies." Laughter rippled along the trench, nervous but real. For a brief instant, the hush was shared not as threat, but as acknowledgement, that both sides were human, that both sides endured the same ritual. Then silence returned, heavy once more. And so it went, day after day, week after week. Dawn, hush, waiting. Dusk, hush, waiting. The rhythm carved itself into the bones of every man. Even years later, veterans woke at dawn without reason, their bodies remembering the ritual long after rifles were set aside. The hush became part of them, a scar of soundlessness they carried forever. In the end, Stand To was not only a defense, it was a meditation, though born of fear. It taught men the weight of silence, the value of stillness. It made them listen to the wind through wire, to the shifting mud, to the beat of their own hearts. And in listening, they came to know the fragility of life with a clarity no words could capture. Loss fell sharp, leaving silence behind. In the trenches, death rarely arrived with warning. A voice would be mid-sentence, a hand gesturing, a laugh echoing against mud walls, and then silence. The cruelest truth was how swiftly presence turned to absence. One heartbeat, a man was alive, sharing his rations or telling a story. The next, he was only a name, a body, a weight carried by stretcher bearers into the rearward gloom. The shock was always quiet. It wasn't the screaming drama one might imagine from a battlefield. Instead, it was a hush that fell heavy over men who had already seen too much. In the aftermath of loss, there were no trumpets, no speeches, no grand gestures. There was simply the emptiness of a voice missing from the chorus, of boots no longer shuffling in the dugout, of a laugh that would never be heard again. It often came by artillery, the most impersonal killer of all. A single shell burst, a flash of light, dirt raining down. When the dust settled, sometimes the man beside you was gone, as if scooped out of existence by the earth itself. The first moments were disbelief, eyes blinking, ears ringing, hearts unable to accept. Then came recognition, the missing shape, the torn kit, the helmet lying still. Men spoke his name softly, not as if calling, but as if acknowledging the absence aloud might make it less unbearable. There was the loss by sniper too, sudden and sharp. One moment, a man raised his head above the parapet, careless by a fraction of a second, and then he crumpled wordlessly, a red mark spreading fast. Sniper bullets made men wary, but they also made them strangely reverent. The victim rarely cried out. He simply fell, and those around him carried him down the trench in silence, eyes fixed ahead. No one wished to meet another's gaze. Gas left another kind of loss. Slower, more cruel. A comrade choking, eyes streaming, lungs burning, his hands clutching at the mask as though tearing it off might somehow save him. Sometimes the mask worked, sometimes it didn't. If it failed, the man's end was prolonged, his gasping echoing through dugouts long after he was carried away. The shock there was not quiet. It was drawn out, filled with coughing and prayers. And yet, afterward, when the sounds ceased, the silence seemed heavier still. Each death brought its own ritual. If time allowed, the chaplain was called, and words were read over the body before it was lowered into shallow earth. A wooden cross hammered into the ground, the man's name scratched or penciled on its surface. Often, though, there was no time. A hasty burial in a shell hole, a marker left if possible, a whispered promise that he was here. The living moved on, for they had no choice. What shocked the men most was not the deaths themselves, though each one tore at the heart, but the swiftness with which life continued around them. The trench demanded attention. Sandbags had to be filled, sentries posted, rifles cleaned. Even as stretcher bearers carried away bodies, others picked up shovels. The war machine ground forward, indifferent to grief. That was its cruelty. Grief had no space. And yet, grief found ways to slip in. It came in the quiet after midnight, when men lay awake in dugouts listening to rats scurry. It came in the pause after mail call, when a man reached instinctively to share his letter with the friend who was no longer there. It came in the tiny rituals, passing a cigarette, saving the last bite of bread, that now felt hollow, for the companion who once received them was gone. Men rarely cried openly. Tears were private, hidden behind helmets or in the cover of night. Instead, grief wore other masks. A sudden silence in the middle of a card game, a muttered curse spat into the mud, a rougher edge to a joke, forced too. Hard humor often became the cloak of loss. Well, he won't have to eat bully beef again, one might say with a crooked grin. The others would chuckle briefly, not because it was funny, but because it was easier than silence. The shock also reshaped bonds. When one man fell, the others drew closer, tighter, like stitches pulling in around a wound. They carried each other more carefully, spoke softer, watched more keenly. Loss reminded them of the fragility of their world, but it also deepened their need for one another. A cigarette offered, a shoulder leaned upon. These small gestures became lifelines. The officers bore their own quiet burdens. They wrote the letters home, informing mothers and wives of the loss. He died bravely, they always wrote, whether the death was sudden, clumsy, or unseen. They could not tell of mud, of fear, of the randomness of it all. They wrapped grief in dignity, for what else could words provide? Some officers confessed quietly to each other that these letters were the hardest duty of all. For the men, the greatest shock was the realization that they too might vanish just as suddenly. Watching a comrade die was like watching a mirror crack. If it could be him, it could be me. That awareness lived in every heart, gnawed at every thought. It made each moment precious, but also unbearable. Some men hardened against it, closing their hearts to avoid the pain. Others leaned in, embracing each bond more fiercely, knowing it might be their last. And so, trench life wove shock into routine. Death was no longer an event. It was an atmosphere, a presence that hovered over every hour. It was the silence after laughter, the gap in the line, the shadow in the dugout. The shock did not fade, but men learned to carry it quietly, like an extra weight in their packs. They grew used to the silence that followed, though it never grew lighter. After the storm, hands learned the art of repair. Morning after a hard night has a particular color in the trenches. Not quite gray, not quite brown, a kind of bruised daylight that seems to have remembered everything it just witnessed. The ground wears the memory plainly, fresh craters ribbed like the inside of a seashell, sandbags torn open to spill pale earth, posts snapped and leaning as though tired of standing at attention. After loss, after thunder, after that tight-fisted hour when breath was measured and words were scarce, there comes a quieter decree, as old as armies: mend what you can. The order doesn't need a voice. It travels by the way men rise. Someone pulls on gloves. Someone else lifts a coil of wire and lets it thump against his thigh. Shovels appear like habits. The trench is not only a place to endure, it is a place to fix. That simple instruction, fix, gives the heart something it can hold without shaking. You and Thomas start at the traverse that took the worst of it. The parapet has slumped. Sandbags burst like loaves cut badly. Thomas palms a needle, huge and curved, a sailmaker's moon, and begins to stitch the bags with twine. He calls it surgery in the dry way he has. Keep the patient breathing, he says, passing the line through burlap with a steady pull. You hold the bag's torn lip, fingers stinging from cold grit, and draw the next sack up in place. It is surprising what a row of careful stitches will do. A seam holds, the wall lifts a little, the corner looks less like a wound. Down the trench, men work in pairs and trios. One digs, one fills, one ties. A rhythm forms, unannounced but reliable, The scrape of shovel blades is the metronome. The grunt when a full bag is heaved up is the downbeat. Above, the sky admits a thread of blue and then changes its mind. A light drizzle, more a thought than a weather, pricks your face and keeps the dust from rising. A blessing, a private says, and no one laughs at the notion. Out here, even drizzle can be promoted. Repair has its small theater too. A duckboard section has split from end to end. A joiner from Leeds squints at it, tongue pressed to a tooth, and decides the board can be saved. He lays it across an ammunition crate like a patient on a table, squares his shoulders, and with 2 nails and a piece of crate lid, gives the board a spine. When he sets it back, it holds. Men step on it as if testing a bridge. It carries them all the same. There now, he says, patting the wood. We'll keep walking. The phrase lands softly, meaning more than it says. By mid-morning, the wire crew moves out, not into the deep dark of no man's land, but to that first, cautious reach beyond the parapet. Wire is more temperamental than it looks. Too tight, and it sings in the wind like a tuning fork. Too slack, and it's no barrier at all. You've learned to wear gloves for barbs, and to wrap a mallet head with cloth, so the taps go out as whispers. Thomas carries the staples in his breast pocket, as if they were coins for a toll gate. Pay the night, he likes to say, or the night will collect with interest. Some repairs are conversations with the past. A broken periscope is brought to you, the glass starred from a nearby blast. The frame is salvageable, the mirror not. A man with careful hands lifts out the shards as if removing ice from a pond, each piece shedding the warped reflection of a cheek, a lip, an eye. You find a spare mirror in the salvage box, its silvering imperfect, clouded at one edge, and fitted in, tap, tap, tap with the butt of a screwdriver. When someone holds it to the loophole, the world jumps back into view. Wire, a mangled post, the suggestion of a trench beyond. Imperfect sight is still sight. The periscope passes to the next pair of hands like a message in better days. Repair is not just timber and twine. It is also the soft architecture of living. The cookhouse alcove lost its windbreak in the night. 2 men retrieve a door from the dump, a door that once belonged to a cottage with a garden, if the flaking paint is any guide. They prop it sideways and brace it with stakes. Wind slackens. Flame agrees to sit still. By noon there is tea again, and with tea the trench rights itself an inch. Cups move hand to hand. The steam carries the scent of leaves, smoke, and a little hope. Where the trench wall bowed inward, threatening a collapse, the sappers arrive with their quiet confidence. They talk to soil the way shepherds talk to dogs, low, coaxing, as though the earth can be asked to behave. Timber is set as ribs. A new drain is cut with a spade so sharp it feels like a pen writing a straight line through mud. Water chooses the new path, obedient for a change. Someone tips you a wink. We've taught it manners. It's a small victory, and it has the good manners to feel larger than it is. The afternoon gives you the task you least favor, clearing the shelled traverse where last night went wrong. There are splinters, twisted wire ends, fragments of tin, a crushed mess tin that looks like a flower closed against cold. You work slower here, not out of fear exactly, but because the hands remember what happened even if the mind is trying not to. Thomas sets a steady pace, making no comment, pocketing a spoon that can be hammered flat later, passing you a rag when dust rises from an old sandbag and stings your eyes. A scrap of someone's letter appears from the churned earth. 3 words only. When you return. You fold it once, twice, and tuck it into the salvage tin where odd screws and uncommon nails live. Not trash, then. Not treasure, either. Something in between, like most of what you carry. There is a hush in repair that does not feel like dread. It is a working hush, full of breath and low instruction. Even the jokes are softer, like laughter wrapped in cloth. That board's straighter than my brother-in-law, someone claims, and a few heads shake with a smile. The humor isn't there to set fires. It's there to keep embers alive. Men find themselves whistling, tuneless and decent, because the mouth longs to shape air into something that isn't worry. By late afternoon, the line looks less like a story that ends and more like a sentence with the next clause ready. The parapet shows fresh faces of burlap. The firing step is raked smooth. The leaning bays stand up a little straighter, as if they've decided to remember their purpose. You step back to see the span you've worked. It's no masterpiece, this stitched-together corridor of clay and wood, but it is safer than it was, kinder to knees and ankles, kinder to hearts. Your palms hold the memory of twine and shovel handles, the texture of things made useful again. Mending extends to people as well, though the materials are different. A private who took the brunt of the blast last night, only a grazing wound, thank God, has retreated into quiet. He answers when spoken to, but otherwise stares at the place where the traverse buckled. Thomas sits near him without ceremony and takes up the careful job of oiling a rifle. You oil the wood, but not so much it runs, he says to no one. You listen for the thread to seat. You don't rush the screw. Let it find home. The private nods eventually and reaches for a rag. Two hands working side by side make a kind of bridge talk can cross later. For now, oil and cloth are words enough. Toward evening, the ration party returns with a bonus of sorts, a stack of newspaper pages used to wrap loaves. The news is old, the ink smudged, but repair has taught you to prefer the use of a thing to its perfection. A headline about a town you once changed trains in, an advertisement for a stove that promises to heat a parlor without smoke or worry, a cartoon that lands its punchline after a delay, as if it too had to slog through mud. Men paste a page or two to the dugout wall with flour and water paste. The paper lies smooth for a minute and then develops ripples like a pond touched by rain. It looks like decor. That is enough to improve the air. When darkness drifts in, unhurried, measuring the trench with its hands, you test the day's work. Boots on the repaired board, a shoulder pressed to the new brace, a glance through the mended periscope, a palm to the parapet's fresh seam, feeling the twine hum a little when the wind noses at it. Everything holds. A small word, hold, and in it, a house of meanings. If there is a doctrine to mending, it is this. You do not argue with damage, you address it. You do not promise the future, you improve the present. You accept that some breaks won't be made whole, only safer. That's enough. In a world that punishes guarantees, repair is honest work, humble and exact. It borrows steadiness from the hands and repays them with a quieter mind. Now the trench prepares for night in that efficient way practiced places do. The tools are stacked, handle out. The hammers go to the left of the box, so sleepy fingers can find them. The coil of wire is kept from rolling by a wedge that used to be a tent peg. A lantern is hooded, the flame made small and trustworthy. The cat, that apprentice quartermaster, inspects the new windbreak and offers approval by settling just inside it, eyes half closed, accepting heat as if she invented it. Someone begins a letter and chooses his words with the same care he gave the periscope frame. We mended the trench today, he writes. You would laugh to see us stitch sandbags like old seamstresses. He hesitates, then adds, It felt good. He crosses out good and writes right instead. He leaves both words legible. Repair is sometimes two truths layered, neither strong enough alone. The line exchanges those last glances, the ones that check if everything is where it should be. Mask? Here. Rifle? Clean. Socks? Dry as the century allows. A hand squeezes a shoulder. A shoulder leans back into the hand. There is no ceremony labeled comfort in the manual. The men make their own. Before you take first watch, you pass once more by the traverse that cost so much last night. The new sandbags sit in their places, like stern-faced aunties, daring mischief to try again. You tap one with the back of your knuckles, a habit that has no science in it and needs none. All right, you say, to the bag, the wall, the night, yourself. It's a single word that means, we'll go on. And because mending invites gratitude, even when no one says the word, you let your eyes climb to the sliver of sky above. Stars appear, late but punctual. A breeze combs the wire, and thanks to careful tension, makes no song. The trench is quieter than it was this morning. The world, your small, trench-wide portion of it, has been set back on its feet. What cannot be mended waits for another kind of care. Slower, longer, mostly silent. But that will come too in its season. In Chaplin's words, in sleep that finally gathers and does not hurry away. In the unaccountable relief of laughter that returns when no one is looking for it. For now, the work has been to mend what can be mended, and you have done it. Letters bring distant voices close again. There are mornings in the trench when nothing seems to move but breath. The air hangs heavy, damp with last night's drizzle, and men stir themselves slowly, as though the day were hesitant to begin. Then comes the moment that draws them upright, that shakes the dust from their shoulders. The mail arrives. Not always, not reliably, but when it does, it changes the weather more surely than sunlight. A corporal appears carrying a sack. He doesn't need to shout. His mere presence draws eyes, ears, and eager hearts. That rough canvas bag is a lifeline disguised as an ordinary bundle. Men gather without marching order, boots scuffing, helmets tilted forward, each pretending a sort of calm while their faces betray the truth. The clerk begins to read names. Each one called is like a candle being lit. Baker, Henderson, McCall. A letter slides into waiting hands, and suddenly the trench feels less like a hole in the earth and more like a hallway that leads home. You hear your own name, soft against the chorus of shovels and footsteps, and a folded envelope touches your palm. The paper is thinner than the clay beneath your boots, yet it carries more weight than any rifle. The letter smells faintly of soap, of the drawer where it rested before posting. You recognize the careful curves of the handwriting. Your mother's, your sister's, perhaps a friend from school. The words within are ordinary. What the weather has been, how the neighbor's cow has calved, what the price of flour is this week. Nothing about shells or wire, or the way the night feels endless. Yet that ordinariness is exactly what you need. In these lines, the world still turns. Kitchens still warm themselves with bread. A dog still waits at the gate. Beside you, Thomas grins faintly at a postcard he's received. It shows a pier at Blackpool, the sea painted in stiff, cheerful blues. On the back, his wife has written only a few lines, but he reads them slowly, then again, lips moving as if tasting the words. She writes about our boy, he murmurs, voice almost embarrassed by its softness. Says he lost his first tooth. The trench, with its ruined sandbags and leaning boards, seems to bend gently toward that detail, as if to listen. Other men clutch their letters with different manners. Some tear them open at once, devouring each sentence, their eyes racing. Others tuck them into pockets to be savored later, when they are alone enough to weep without witness. A few receive nothing and stare at the mud, feigning indifference. Their comrades, without remark, offer to share a bit of theirs, read aloud a line from a sister's joke, or pass around a tin of sweets that arrived wrapped in brown paper. Sharing becomes a balm for those left out. When a parcel comes, laughter follows. Socks knitted by churchwomen appear, and men slip them over their tired feet with reverence, as though holy objects had been delivered. A tin of jam, dented from the journey, is pried open and shared on biscuits. A bar of chocolate is divided into squares so small they barely touch the tongue, yet each man insists the taste is unmistakable. Someone produces a photograph, smudged from the road, of a girl standing in a doorway. For a moment, 5 men peer over his shoulder, quiet as parishioners. Then one chuckles, "She's out of your league, mate." And the laughter is grateful, not cruel. Letters are not always soothing. Some carry sorrow, news of a friend killed in another regiment, a child ill, a harvest lost. The reader sits still, eyes scanning the same line again and again, as though refusing to believe. Around him, silence grows, a respect more eloquent than comfort. No one offers easy words. They simply remain near, boots planted, letting presence be its own reply. In time, the man folds the letter, slides it into his breast pocket, and goes back to the work of the day, carrying its weight like an extra ration tin. The act of writing back is its own ceremony. In the lull of afternoon, when tools are stacked and rifles cleaned, men draw stubby pencils from kit bags and smooth sheets of paper against their knees. The trench becomes a library without shelves, heads bent, lips pursed, sentences scraped onto paper. They rarely tell the truth of shellfire or fear. Instead, they describe the weather, the meals, a joke told by a sergeant. They promise they are well, even when sleep has been scarce for a week. One man draws a sketch of the trench cat curled in a helmet, shading it carefully, as though he were back at school. You too take up your pencil. Words come haltingly at first. How to bridge the distance between mud and parlor. You write about the dawn, how the mist curls over the parapet, how birdsong sometimes dares to break through the rattle of guns. You omit the coughing of a wounded man in the next dugout, the smell of cordite that clings to your sleeves. The letter is a gift. You will not stain it with all that cannot be washed away. At dusk, the collection begins. Letters are tied in bundles, sealed with wax or string, and carried down the communication trenches by runners. From there, they will pass to carts, to trains, to ships, to sorting offices across the sea. The journey is long and uncertain, yet men trust in it as they trust in sunrise. Somewhere, weeks from now, a mother will unfold your paper, and her breath will steady. She will read your careful sentences and imagine you safe. That imagining will be its own shelter. Night settles, and those who still have letters in their hands read them once more by candle stub. The flame trembles, shadows lean long, but the words stay steady. We miss you. We pray for you. The roses are late this year. Simple lines, ordinary to anyone else, yet extraordinary to the reader. They are proof that life still exists beyond the trench, waiting like a light in another room. And so, in the dark, men fold their treasures and tuck them under tunics, close to the heart. Some sleep with envelopes beneath their heads as if pillows. Others slip photographs into helmet linings, carrying faces with them on sentry duty. These fragile papers are stronger than steel, stronger than timber, because they bind men not to the trench, but to the world beyond it. Repair may keep the walls standing, but letters keep the spirit from collapsing. And tonight, as the guns rest a little, as the damp earth cools, you let your fingers trace the edge of your own envelope, and you whisper the name written on it. That whisper joins the countless others drifting along the line, a chorus of absent voices made present by ink and paper. Shared stories shape a hearth of trust. Evening came softly, as it so often did in the trenches, slipping in without fanfare. The guns might still mutter in the distance, yet among the dugouts and makeshift shelters, men found a quieter rhythm. After a day of labor, draining water, stacking sandbags, repairing shattered parapets, there arrived a pause, fragile but real. It was in these pauses that stories were born. Stories were not luxuries here, they were necessities. They gave shape to hours that might otherwise dissolve into dread. Around a lantern shielded from enemy eyes, or beside a brazier burning scraps of wood, men gathered. They sat close, knees drawn up, tin cups warm in their hands. Faces glowed faintly in the light, shadows deepening the lines that war had carved into them. One began with a memory. "When I was a lad," he'd say, voice carrying just enough to reach those nearest. The story might be of fishing at dawn, of a mischievous dog stealing Sunday roast, of the first awkward dance with a sweetheart. Men leaned in. They did not care about plot or polish. They cared about tone, about the sound of a familiar life that seemed impossibly far away. Each word was a spark, warming the circle. Thomas, with his Manchester accent, was a favorite teller. He spun tales of factory floors, of narrow streets where neighbors knew every secret. He described the rattle of looms, the clatter of tram cars, the smell of coal smoke rising from chimneys. Others closed their eyes as he spoke, not to sleep but to see. For a few minutes, the mud walls fell away, replaced by brick houses and cobblestone alleys. Another man told of Ireland, of fields so green they hurt the eye, of music played on fiddles until dawn. His story wound gently, punctuated with soft laughter. He spoke of a cousin who tried to milk a bull once, convinced it was a cow. The circle erupted in muffled chuckles, shoulders shaking, eyes glinting in the dim light. Laughter here was precious, not loud or raucous, but deep, like water found in a dry well. Sometimes the stories turned darker, shaded with gallows humor. A corporal described an officer so proper that even under shell fire he insisted men salute. One of these days, the corporal grinned, a shell will salute him back. Men laughed, though the laughter carried an edge. These tales were a way of defanging fear, of turning the absurdity of war into something small enough to mock. Yet the most cherished stories were not about war at all. They were about kitchens, about gardens, about fields where wheat bent in summer wind. They were about children's first steps, about sisters' weddings, about the promise of Sunday dinners. The trench craved these pictures of ordinary life, as if each memory were a log tossed onto a dwindling fire. Without them, warmth would fade. There was trust in the telling. To share a memory was to reveal a corner of the soul not armored by uniform or mud. A man might never confess his fear, but he would describe the way his mother's hands kneaded bread, or the sound of bells from the church at dusk. These details, seemingly small, became the foundation of brotherhood. They reminded every listener that beneath helmets and puttees were men, not machines. Occasionally, the chaplain joined the circle. His stories carried a different cadence, scriptural echoes woven with gentle humor. He spoke not of battles or sermons, but of fishing trips with his father, of hymns sung in small country churches where the rafters creaked. His voice had the steadiness of oak, and though men might roll their eyes at prayers, they leaned in to hear his tales. He reminded them, without insisting, that life was larger than the war. Not all men were natural tellers. Some preferred to listen, nodding slowly, their silence its own gift. Others offered fragments, a phrase, a half-remembered song lyric, the description of a streetlight glowing against rain. These fragments were gathered by the circle, woven into the larger fabric. In the act of listening, each man contributed, even without words. There were nights when stories grew communal, passed from voice to voice, like a bottle making its way around the fire. One man began with a train journey, another added the station porter's complaints, a third inserted the mishap of a luggage lost. By the time the tale ended, it bore little resemblance to truth, but it belonged to all of them. Shared invention, shared laughter, shared relief. What made the stories powerful was not their grandeur, but their ordinariness. They reminded the men of what they fought for, though that phrase was rarely spoken. They fought for the chance to sit in kitchens again, to walk lanes without ducking shells, to tell stories not as survival, but as leisure. They fought for the return of simplicity, and in these circles, they rehearsed it. The hearth was not literal. No roaring fireplace stood in the trench. The hearth was the closeness of voices, the glow of faint light against weary faces. It was the way stories wrapped around the men, insulating them from the night's damp and the ever-present thought of danger. In that warmth, trust grew. Trust that each man would stand his post. Trust that each would remember him if he fell. Trust that stories themselves could carry them through another dawn. When the hour grew late and the candles guttered low, the circle thinned. One by one, men shuffled back to their dugouts, still carrying the residue of voices. The trench, for all its mud and misery, felt less like a grave and more like a camp where companions huddled. The stories lingered in the air, invisible embers glowing faintly. Tomorrow drifts closer in fragile hope. The night was never truly silent, not on the Western Front. Even when the guns rested, their echo clung to the air like smoke. Yet in the trench, as one day gave itself reluctantly to the next, there arrived hours that felt almost still. These were the hours when men allowed themselves to think of tomorrow. Not the military tomorrow, full of orders and duty, but the imagined tomorrow that lived far beyond the line. It was dangerous work, this business of hope. Too much of it, and disappointment cut like shrapnel. Too little, and the spirit withered. So men learned to cradle hope gently, as though it were a fragile bird that might startle and fly if gripped too tightly. A few spoke of it aloud. Thomas, polishing his rifle with exaggerated care, said, "When this ends, I'll take my boy fishing. He'll be big enough by then." He didn't meet anyone's eye, but a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. No one laughed at the picture. Instead, another man added softly, "I'll plant apple trees. Never had a garden before. Suppose I'll give it a try." The trench transformed for a moment into a kitchen table where neighbors discussed plans, not a military outpost. A line of small futures stretched across the mud like bunting, each man tying his own to the thread. Some spoke of shops they hoped to open, or pubs they longed to return to. Others dreamed of walking through cities untouched by war, hearing the bustle of markets instead of the boom of shells. Letters encouraged such talk. A note from home might mention a field needing plowing. a baby's christening, or a cousin's engagement. These words became seeds. Soldiers watered them with imagination, picturing themselves present at those future moments. They did not say, "If I survive," though the condition hung heavy in the air. They said, "When," because when kept the embers of courage glowing. Yet hope in the trenches was not always grand. Sometimes it was as modest as the thought of a hot bath, or a bed without lice, or bread not flecked with mold. A man might close his eyes and picture the clean sheets of his childhood home, the smell of soap on his pillow. That picture was enough to carry him through another watch on the firing step. Others clung to rituals of hope. A private carried a bent penny, said to have saved him when shrapnel struck his pocket. Another refused to shave before going into battle, convinced the stubble shielded him from bad luck. These small superstitions were not foolishness, but scaffolding, ways of keeping the structure of hope from collapsing under bombardment. At times, hope arrived uninvited, born on the smallest details. The way dawn painted no man's land in silver mist could remind a man of autumn mornings at home. The call of a bird, improbably surviving near the wire, might spark a memory of hedgerows and fields. Even the smell of tea brewing in a dented tin mug could pull a man toward thoughts of kitchens, of family, of life beyond the trench. The officers, though often younger than their men, bore hope differently. They carried it in notebooks, in maps folded and unfolded by candlelight. They spoke of strategies, of advances, of victories that would surely come. Some men listened with skepticism, but others let those words settle like sandbags against despair. If the officer believed in tomorrow's purpose, perhaps it was safer to believe as well. Hope had its shadows too. There were men who could not bring themselves to picture tomorrow, for tomorrow might demand too much. These men kept their eyes on the ground before them, their minds wrapped tightly around the task at hand. To imagine the future was to invite heartbreak. And yet, even they sometimes betrayed themselves. A muttered comment about a sweetheart's letter, a sigh at the smell of rain, recalling a plowed field. The truth was that hope, like water, seeped into every crack, no matter how often men tried to dam it. It was there in the quiet when men closed their eyes. It was there in the stories shared around a lantern. It was there in the careful folding of letters, in the way photographs were tucked safely near the heart. One night, as the trench quieted, Thomas leaned against the parapet and whispered, "Suppose the world will ever feel normal again?" The question hung heavy. No one answered at first. Then an older sergeant murmured, "Normal changes, lad. What comes after may not be what was before, but there'll be fields and children and Sunday dinners again. That much, I reckon." The words were plain, yet they fell like balm. The men listened to the sergeant, not for certainty, but for steadiness. Tomorrow did not need to be grand. It only needed to exist. And so they let the fragile hope drift closer, enough to carry them through another long night, enough to let them sleep despite the damp, enough to let them rise when dawn returned with its usual call. Stand to night sky opens, leaving the path unclosed. The night was clear, and that in itself felt like a gift. Clouds had lifted, revealing a sweep of stars that seemed impossibly bright above the battered landscape. For the men in the trenches, the sight was both humbling and haunting. They lay on their backs when duty allowed, or tilted their heads during sentry watches, gazing upward at constellations that had looked down upon shepherds, sailors, and wanderers for thousands of years. The war could scar the earth, but it could not touch the stars. They were the same lights their mothers had seen, the same beacons their children might one day wish upon. In those scattered points of silver, men found an opening, a reminder that the world extended beyond mud walls and barbed wire. It was here, beneath the sweep of the night sky, that conversations softened into whispers. Some men spoke of homes they longed for, others of loves waiting far away. A photograph, worn thin from handling, passed from hand to hand. It showed a child barely walking, a farmhouse with ivy, a sweetheart smiling awkwardly. Each man who looked upon it seemed to recognize a fragment of his own life, as though the picture held pieces of all their tomorrows. Others did not speak at all. They let silence do the work, breathing slowly, listening to the quiet between distant shells. In that quiet lived something larger than themselves, perhaps faith, perhaps memory, perhaps only the gentle rhythm of existence. Whatever it was, it steadied them. Not every man believed he would survive to see those futures. Some held hope tightly. Others set it aside to avoid the sharpness of disappointment. Yet even the most resigned felt the tug of possibility when the stars spread overhead. The constellations traced lines not of trenches, but of journeys, of paths across oceans and plains, of stories unfinished. It was in this space, this fragile, suspended moment, that the idea of after returned, not as a certainty, nor even as a promise, but as a possibility. The war would not last forever. History itself showed that nothing did. Empires rose and fell, seasons turned, rivers carved valleys, then shifted course. So too would the front one day fade, the earth closing over scars, the silence of fields replacing the thunder of guns. Thomas, leaning on his entrenching tool, whispered, "Strange, isn't it? Thinking of life going on without all this?" His words were neither bitter nor hopeful, just thoughtful, as if testing the air. Another man answered, "Maybe that's what keeps us, knowing it won't last. Someday there'll be children here, running where we lie now. They won't know our names, but they'll live." The thought carried no resentment, only a faint tenderness. Men imagined those children, imagined the grass grown thick over shell craters, imagined cows grazing where machine guns once stood. The pictures floated gently, fragile as lanterns on a river. No one clutched them too tightly for fear of breaking them, but they let them drift because drifting was enough. Stories continued, even here at the edge of exhaustion. Some recounted the day's duties, turning them into anecdotes tinged with humor. Others spoke of places they had never seen but longed to, Paris after peace, quiet villages untouched by shell fire, the beaches of childhood holidays. The war confined their bodies, but imagination roamed freely, skipping over barbed wire and borders. The night wore on. Stars shifted slowly across the sky, and with them, men drifted into uneasy sleep. Dreams mingled with memory, carrying them away for a few hours. For some, those dreams returned them to kitchens, to gardens, to laughter carried on summer wind. For others, the dreams echoed with battle. Yet even then, the sky remained overhead, steady, patient, ancient. When the bugle called at dawn, the stars would fade. The routines would resume. Stand to, breakfast, duties, waiting. The cycle would continue, as it always did. But for now, under the vault of night, there was an opening. The war felt smaller against the vastness of the cosmos, and men, for all their weariness, felt less alone. The night sky offered no promises. It left the path unclosed. The men did not know where the road would lead, home, to peace, or back to the mud. Yet the openness itself was a comfort. To live in possibility, however uncertain, was to live still. and that was enough to carry them one step further. Yesterday's voices linger, yet today speaks differently. There is a certain hush when we look back at those trenches now, as if time itself lowers its voice out of respect. The mud, the fear, the brotherhood. They remain vivid in memory and history, yet the world that has grown from them feels like a different country altogether. Once, soldiers woke each dawn to the cry of "Stand to," their boots sinking in waterlogged boards, their breaths clouding in the damp air. Today, the dawn still comes, but it falls upon fields restored to quiet, grass and grain growing where barbed wire once tangled. If you stand along the old line of the Western Front, you might hear birdsong instead of artillery. The skylark's notes rise, delicate and unbroken, above the soft sweep of farmland. Where once machine guns cracked without mercy, now farmers tend their tractors, pulling neat rows across the soil. A century has smoothed the scars. Yet if you know how to look, you will find them still. Gentle ridges that run across a meadow, the outline of a trench now softened but not erased, a patch of forest where young trees were planted to cover the broken earth. The land remembers, even when it has forgiven, and the people remember too, though in quieter ways. In small French and Belgian villages, plaques hang on stone walls, listing names that might otherwise have been lost. Children walk past on their way to school, perhaps not stopping to read them, but their very presence, the fact that school bells ring where once the guns thundered, is its own answer to the past. Life continued. Life overcame. The world has changed more than those soldiers could have imagined. Letters that once took weeks to travel now arrive in an instant, glowing on screens. The loneliness that gnawed at men in dugouts has been softened, in our time, by the hum of connection that stretches across oceans in a heartbeat. They crouched in darkness, straining to catch the sound of a comrade's voice. We can press a button and see the face of someone we love, no matter the distance. And yet, even in all this change, there is a thread that binds then to now. The longing for connection, the quiet courage of ordinary people, the hope for tomorrow. These have not vanished. They wear new clothing, speak in new tongues, but they remain the same at their core. When we read those trench diaries, or walk the rows of white crosses in a military cemetery, it is not horror alone that we meet. It is a reminder of resilience, of how people endure and reshape their lives even after nights of unimaginable darkness. The men who once huddled under leaking sandbags could not know that one day tourists would walk above their heads, carrying guidebooks, pausing to read their stories. They could not know that children would ride bicycles down country lanes that once were front lines. They could not know that silence could return. History softens with distance, like the edge of a photograph fading with time. What once was terror becomes, for us, a lesson. The lice, the mud, the endless watches in the rain. They feel distant, almost unreal. But perhaps that distance is part of our responsibility. To look clearly, to remember, and to honor, not with pity, but with gratitude. For in every quiet night we enjoy, there is an echo of someone's restless night in a dugout. Day and night, past and present, they lean against each other like old friends. What has changed is not just technology, nor the absence of war on those fields, but our ability to see them with gentler eyes, to know that the world does not end even when it feels broken, to recognize that peace, once impossible to imagine, can settle like dew. The voices of yesterday do not fade. They weave themselves into the quiet of today. Rest in that knowledge that the world has moved forward and yet remembers. Muddy silence then, quiet living rooms now. If we linger long enough with the old stories, we can almost feel the texture of that life. The soggy boots, the lice in every seam, the constant watch for a flare in the sky. Yet when we look around at our lives today, the contrast is almost impossible to grasp. Then, a soldier's world shrank to a few hundred yards of mud. Now our world stretches into living rooms bathed in lamplight, kitchens humming with electric stoves, voices drifting from radios or television sets. 100 years ago, silence in the trench was never safe. It meant listening, holding breath, waiting for the whistle of a shell. Silence carried weight, pressing on the chest. But silence today can be a comfort, the hush of a house when the day's work is done, the soft tick of a clock, the sound of a cat turning in its sleep. What once was a sign of dread has become a balm, proof that no danger waits just beyond the wall. Food tells the same story of change. In the dugout, men poked at tins of bully beef and hard biscuits, their bodies burning calories faster than their rations could supply. Mold crept into loaves before they reached the front. Today, our shelves carry choices those men could never have dreamed of. Fresh fruit in winter, bread still warm from the bakery, even meals that arrive at the door with a knock and a smile. Hunger was a constant in the trenches, gnawing and unsatisfied. Now it is, for many of us, an occasional inconvenience, a question of taste rather than survival. Communication, too, has shifted beyond recognition. In those days, letters took weeks to cross battlefields and seas. A man might write of his survival in September, only for the letter to arrive in October, after he had already fallen. Families waited in uncertainty, measuring time by the postman's steps. Today, we grow impatient if a message takes more than a few seconds to send. We video call across continents as if the distance were nothing at all. What was once unbearable silence has become constant presence, the ability to see the face of a loved one in a moment. And yet, there is a curious link. For all our speed, the longing is the same. The men in the trenches wrote of mothers, of sweethearts, of children not yet born. We too speak of family, of friends, of love. The medium has changed, but the message endures. Even in our connected age, we search for words to say the same things. I'm safe. I miss you. I'm thinking of you. Think of warmth. In the trenches, warmth was rare. A tot of rum passed hand to hand, socks dried by a small flame, shoulders pressed together in the cold. Today, warmth comes with the twist of a thermostat, the flick of a switch. Central heating hums in walls, unseen yet reliable. But the deeper warmth, the kind that rests in kindness, remains just as precious now as it was then. A neighbor dropping off soup, a grandchild covering your knees with a blanket, a friend calling at just the right moment. That warmth has not changed, though the world around it has. Even rest itself carries a different meaning. Then, sleep was snatched in shallow dugouts, boots never removed, nerves always alert for the next bombardment. Sleep was fragile, broken, a mercy never guaranteed. Now, we lie down in beds layered with blankets, pillows chosen for comfort, alarms set not for danger, but for routine. We may still wake in the night. Some of us often do. But our waking is rarely to the whistle of gas shells or the crash of artillery. The fears that stir us now are quieter, and though real, they carry no shrapnel. As I think on it, perhaps what has changed most is the scale of fear. A century ago, it was vast and immediate. The next shell, the next order, the next raid. Today, our fears are softer, often more inward. Health, loneliness, the slow passage of time. Neither is simple, but one leaves room for gentler remedies. Tea brewed at dawn, a phone call from a friend, the steadying hand of a loved one. Walking the old battlefields today, you may see couples strolling arm in arm, or children laughing as they run across grass that once hid trenches. Farmers plow the land, unaware, or perhaps deliberately aware, of the history beneath their wheels. The earth has turned back to ordinary life, and that is its triumph. The land has healed enough to carry laughter again. And so, when we sit quietly in our living rooms, when we feel safe enough to let our eyes close and drift, we are living the very future those soldiers once dreamed of in their dugouts. They could not imagine our electric lights, our endless shelves of books, our screens glowing with connection, but they longed for the same peace that settles around us now, in the hush of evening. Yesterday's shadows, today's gentle light. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, few could have imagined the distance we would one day travel from that world of mud and wire. Yet as years gathered into decades, and decades into a century, the memory of those trenches did not vanish. It became instead a quiet bridge, stretching from the past into our present, a reminder of what was endured and what was changed. Stand at a memorial today, and you see names, thousands carved into stone, each one once a living heartbeat, once a letter writer, once a son or a friend. Around those stones, though, life continues. Bicycles lean against walls, children kick footballs across the grass, families gather for picnics in fields that once echoed with fire. The bridge of time allows us to hold both truths at once, the grief of what was lost and the quiet beauty of what has grown since. Daily life has moved far from the dugouts and sandbags. Where once a soldier scratched a note by candle stub, today a grandmother sends her thoughts by email, her words arriving instantly across the globe. Where once men strained for a sip of clean water, we now twist a tap and fill a glass with ease. Where once warmth meant huddling against a comrade in the cold, today it hums through radiators and soft blankets. Each change feels ordinary to us now, yet each would have seemed a miracle to those who lived then. Still, the heart of it, the need for connection, for comfort, for peace, remains untouched. Soldiers passed around photographs worn thin at the edges, tracing faces with roughened fingers. We pass phones across a table, showing the same precious faces on glowing screens. They shared scraps of bread or a cigarette lit in silence. We share cups of tea, a plate of cookies, a story told across a kitchen table. Different forms, same longing, to know we are not alone. There is wisdom in looking back, not to dwell, but to understand the scale of change. For those soldiers, life was measured in hours survived, letters received, socks dried. For us, it is measured in appointments, television schedules, holiday plans. Yet when night falls and the world grows still, the same questions rise. Will tomorrow be kind? Will my loved ones be safe? And in that common ground, the bridge holds steady. What we learn when we linger on these stories is that peace itself is extraordinary. It hides in plain sight, in the sound of a kettle boiling, in the soft turning of a page, in the creak of a rocking chair. To those who lived in trenches, such moments would have been treasures beyond price. To us, they are the fabric of daily life. The bridge between then and now is built upon gratitude, whether we pause to feel it or not. Sometimes, the past comes forward in unexpected ways. A shell casing turned into a vase sits on a mantel. A faded diary lies in a drawer. A song once sung in the dark trenches echoes faintly in a film soundtrack. These are small threads, reminders that the world we inhabit was woven from sacrifices we may never fully grasp. The bridge is not only made of monuments, it lives in these small inheritances of memory. And so, tonight, as we rest, we carry with us both the echoes of what was and the softness of what is. We may not sleep in dugouts, but we too know the relief of closing tired eyes. We may not fear the whistle of shells, but we too sometimes stir with worry in the night. The difference is that our mornings bring peace, not fire. That difference was hard won. It is the bridge that time has given us. The war belongs to yesterday, but its lessons belong to us. Rest easy, knowing the world has changed, and that change allows peace to sit beside you tonight like an old friend.